Hi, I'm Bisma, and you're listening to The Other C Word, a podcast about all things cancer from a stage 4 breast cancer warrior. We cover health and wellness, mind, body, and soul. Plan to leave each episode with hopefully some new insights and inspiration. Let's get into this week's episode. Welcome back, everyone, to The Other C Word, where we talk about all the fun, layers, and complexities of living with cancer. All right, so today I'm doing a solo episode, and I want to share some thoughts that have been on my mind lately about the emotions that go with having cancer, and specifically the emotions of grief, growth, and joy. Now, I think these might seem like three totally different things: grief, growth, and joy. But for me, they've been connected in a way I never expected before my cancer diagnosis. And maybe you've experienced that too, how the hardest times of your life have also brought some of the most profound realizations and even small moments of happiness. So whether you're someone who is living with cancer yourself, supporting a loved one, or just looking for a bit of hope in a tough time, I think hopefully this episode will speak to you. So let's get into it. Grief. It's such a heavy word, right? And I think most of us, we tend to associate it with a singular type of loss, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a life. But in my experience, grief is so much broader than that. It's something you feel when life doesn't turn out the way you thought it would. And it's not just about losing people, it's about losing plans, it's about losing control and losing the version of yourself that you thought you'd always be. For me, that grief hit the hardest in the months that came after getting diagnosed with cancer. I remember laying in the emergency room and hearing those words, "You have metastatic cancer." For me, it was shock and disbelief. And I was in so much physical pain that I couldn't even process the words being said to me. I think at that moment, I just thought, okay, so does this mean I can get some pain medication now? Like, what does this actually mean for me in the moment? Which really just says a lot about my physical state at the time. It wasn't until months later that things really started to settle in for me. This feeling that my whole life, everything I had imagined for myself was essentially being ripped away from me. It felt like there was this version of my life I had been building up in my mind subconsciously, and in a quick moment, it was gone. So I had to grieve for the future that I thought I would have. And let me tell you, that's a really complicated thing to grieve for because it's not something tangible. It's not like losing a job or a home. It's losing an idea. It's losing a dream, a sense of who you are. And that kind of loss isn't as obvious to others, but it's very real and very painful. I think we often don't talk enough about the grief that comes with a diagnosis like cancer. I think there is so much focus on surviving, on thriving, on being strong and fighting, that we forget there's a part of us that needs to grieve the life that we're leaving behind. And I think that's okay. I think it's necessary, in fact. You have to give yourself permission to feel that loss, to mourn it before you're actually able to move forward. I think one of the hardest things for me has been coming to terms with the fact that the plans that I had made for my life would need to change. I had this whole timeline in my mind, things I wanted to do, milestones I wanted to reach, goals I thought I would have already achieved or want to achieve. And cancer came in and messed all of that up. I had actually just gotten married less than 6 months before my diagnosis. I was finally going to become a mom and have a child. And sadly, that child never made it to this world. I generally struggled with this idea of control. I've been like that my whole life. And I'm just the type of person who likes to plan things out, who feels the most comfortable when I know what's coming next. But with Cancer, you don't have that luxury, especially even more so when it's advanced or aggressive or it returns after you thought you were done with it. It's highly unpredictable, and that unpredictability has been terrifying for me. I've had to learn how to let go of that sense of control. And let me tell you, it's really not easy when you have a type A personality. For me, letting go felt like I was giving up, but I've come to realize that it's not. It's not giving up. And it's actually a way of making room for something new. And I think that's where growth begins. But maybe before we dive into that, I'll pause and I want you to reflect on your own life. Have you ever experienced a moment in your life where you had to let go of something and realize that you don't have control over it? What did that feel like for you? And how did you cope? So, as I reflect on my own journey with grief, I've realized that it doesn't fully disappear. I think maybe it changes shape, but it's always there in some form. And that's okay. I'm learning to carry it differently over time. It's no longer this heavy, suffocating feeling that it was in the beginning. Now it feels more quiet, more in the background of my life, something that's still present, but it's not overwhelming and consistent all the time. I've also learned that grief isn't linear. There are days when I feel like I've moved past it, and then something will trigger those feelings of loss all over again. And that's okay too. I'm learning that grief doesn't have a timeline, and it's important to honor the process no matter how long it takes. And it could take the rest of my life, actually. I think for anyone who's listening, who's dealing with their own grief, whether it's related to cancer or something else, just know that it's okay to feel what you're feeling. It's okay to grieve the life that you thought you'd have. And it's okay to take your time with it. It's okay to have days where you feel like you've made progress, and it's okay to have days that feel like you're going backwards. It's actually all a part of the journey, and that's what we have to come to terms with. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about growth. Growth is one of those things that people love to talk about when they're encouraging you to stay positive during hard times, right? But I think there's a misconception that growth only happens when you're feeling strong and feeling capable. In my experience, the opposite is true. My most profound moments of growth have happened when I felt completely broken. I think there's something about adversity, whether it's a cancer diagnosis, a personal loss, or some other sort of hardship, that just strips away the layers of who you thought you were. And you're left with this raw, vulnerable version of yourself. And I think that's where the real growth happens. And I will say it's not necessarily pretty. It's not inspiring in the way we often romanticize growth. It's actually messy, painful, and can be really exhausting. For me, cancer has been a constant teacher in growth. It's taught me to be more patient with myself, to let go of that continuous need for control, and to become okay with uncertainty. I've learned that growth isn't about powering through the tough times, but it's about allowing myself to be soft while growing through them. It's about embracing being vulnerable and accepting that sometimes the only way to grow is to let yourself fall apart for a while. I want to share a specific story about this particular moment when I had realized how much I had actually grown. It was after my spine had fractured in multiple locations, and I was in the hospital at UCSF, just feeling like my body had completely betrayed me. I was lying there, unable to move. Any small movement was causing intense pain. I was crying, screaming, and I started to feel this feeling of hopelessness, of wanting to give up. And I think when I look back at it, it was actually a feeling of grief is what I was feeling. And I felt myself getting pulled into this dark place where, you start to question everything. Why me? Why now? Did I do something to deserve this? Am I a bad person? But then something shifted, and I realized that even in that moment of complete despair, that I had grown. I wasn't the same person I was when I first got diagnosed. I had learned how to sit with the discomfort, how to ride out the waves of the physical pain. And I knew that they weren't going to drown me, but instead it was something that I was going to get through. Still here, I was still alive, I was still fighting. I had somehow learned how to find peace and gratitude even in those small moments, even though it felt like my body was completely falling apart. I felt grateful. And for me, I think that was growth. It wasn't some big triumphant moment. It was quiet. It was subtle, but it was real. And I think growth for me has also meant learning how to be present. Before cancer, I was always thinking ahead. What's next? What's the next goal? The next achievement? But cancer has really forced me to slow down. I think it forces you to live in the moment because the future is so uncertain. I've come to learn and appreciate the here and the now in a way that I never did before. And it's something that I never even knew that I wasn't doing before. I've learned that sometimes growth means letting go of the idea that you have to constantly be striving for something more. And sometimes it's okay just to exist, just be. So maybe, now's a good time to take a moment for yourself and think about how you've grown through your own challenges. Maybe it wasn't obvious at first. Maybe it wasn't the kind of growth that you expected. But I bet that if you look back, you can see how you've changed in ways that surprise you. And I think that's the beauty of growth. It often happens when we're not even aware of it or least expect it to happen. All right, now let's talk about joy. This might seem like an odd thing to bring up in the context of cancer, but I found that joy is something that can coexist alongside grief and pain. In fact, I think it's actually necessary, and I think it's actually a really needed companion for grief and pain. Without those small moments of joy, the weight of everything else would be pretty much unbearable. For a long time, I thought joy was something that happened to you, something that you experienced when everything was going right in life. It was a destination to reach. Like if you did all of the things that you need to do, you would have joy. But Cancer has taught me that joy is something you create. Even in those really dark moments, it's a choice, it's an act, and it's something deliberate. There was a moment early on in my diagnosis when I was feeling completely overwhelmed by everything. I was sitting in the hospital, hooked up to a bunch of machines, and I just felt so down, so defeated. Weeks had gone by, and I was still in there and wasn't seeing any end in sight. But then a friend would come visit me, and we would play a game or just talk, or someone would send my family a text that, they would then read to me. And it wasn't anything huge, but in that moment, it felt like these were the kindest things in the world. And I realized that I could still find joy, even here, even in this hospital with a bunch of wires connected to me, a bunch of medications going through my body. I could still find joy. I realized that there were still things there that were raising my spirits and making me laugh and making me smile. Since then, I've made a conscious effort to look for joy in the small things. It could be a good smoothie or a good cup of tea. It could be a funny meme from a friend. It could be a quiet moment with the book that I'm reading right now. It could be a board game, cuddling with my dog Bella. These are the things that remind me that even in the midst of pain, life is still happening. And I think there's so much beauty in that. Joy doesn't need to be this huge, overwhelming feeling. It can be quiet, it can be simple, it could be small. And those small moments can add up in ways that make even the hardest days feel a little bit more bearable. I think that's one of the most important lessons that Cancer has taught me, that joy can coexist with everything else happening. It's not an either or, it's a both and. I can be grieving the life I thought I'd have. I can be struggling in pain and have a lot of fear about the future, but I can also still laugh at something funny or feel that warm feeling that you have after a conversation with a loved one. Those things don't cancel each other out. I want to take a moment to encourage you to think about the small moments of joy in your own life, especially if you're going through something tough right now. Maybe it's a phone call with a friend or a moment of like peace and quiet during a walk, or even your favorite food or your favorite show that you're currently watching. It doesn't have to be big and profound. It just has to remind you that even in those hardest moments, there's still room for light. One of the ways that I've started incorporating more joy into my daily life is by practicing gratitude. And I know that can sound cliche, like you may roll your eyes at it, but it really does make a difference. So every day I try to write down at least one thing that I'm grateful for. I use a 5-minute gratitude journal. You can find them on Amazon. Shout out to my friend Anita for getting me my first one. And I think journaling things I'm grateful for, it's not always easy, especially on those really tough days, but it helps me to remember that even while everything's going on, there's still good in my life. Sometimes it's things like I'm grateful for being able to sleep most of the night, or I'm grateful for not waking up in pain. And other times it's something smaller, something in the sense of I'm grateful for so-and-so making me laugh. I'm grateful for this show that I'm currently into. By the way, I just finished watching The Perfect Couple on Netflix. It is so good. So those small moments of gratitude really help me to see that there's always joy around me and I just have to look for it. And I think that's the takeaway here. Joy isn't something that's reserved for perfect moments. It's something you can find even in the messiest, hardest parts of your life. And I think it comes down to training yourself to see the beauty in the small things and allowing yourself to experience happiness, even when everything else feels overwhelming. Okay, so I think with that, we'll wrap it up for today. I do want to leave you with this one thought. Grief, growth, and joy are all intertwined. You can experience all three at once, and that's completely normal and completely okay. You don't have to choose between being strong and feeling broken, or between grieving and finding joy. Life is super complicated, and it's possible to hold all of those emotions at the same time, for them to be coming and going at different times. So I hope this episode gave you some insight, or maybe even just a little bit of comfort knowing that you're not alone in navigating these feelings. And I just want you to know that it's okay to feel everything you're feeling. There's no right or wrong way to handle these emotions. All right, I hope this episode resonated with you. And if it did, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at Bisma, DM me or leave a comment. I'd love to know how you're finding your own moments of growth and joy in the middle of your own hardships. So as always, thank you guys for joining me. Thanks for listening to The Other C Word, hosted by Bisma. New episodes drop Mondays. Connect with me on socials at Bisma, and let's all learn, grow, and inspire each other.